Hello, my name is
Carolina, and Pastor Jeff has been preaching on 1 Peter 2 about biblical submission. And so I was wondering, when Peter says to submit to the authorities, how does the civil rights movement fit in with that?
Submit to authority, and how does the civil right, what part of civil rights are you talking about?
Mainly in the 60s during the marches and the sit-ins and...
Yeah, and where do strikes fit in? Marches, sit-ins, all of that. That's a good question, Carolina. Let's first look at what Peter says, and then we'll go back to Paul's. So we can go to 1 Peter, where he tells us in chapter, I think it's 2, 1 Peter 2, starting in verse 13 onward, it says, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether the king is supreme, or to governors as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who are good. For this is the will of God." You know, a lot of people are always wondering what the will of God is. There are 5 times it very clearly says this is the will of God. And this one is one. "This is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, not using your liberty as a cloak for vice, as bondservants." And then he lays it on in verse 17. "Honor all people." We should be the least prejudiced, the least discriminatory, the least sarcastic, the least racially anything people in the world. We're supposed to honor everybody. We're supposed to love the brotherhood that's in Christ. Of course, fear God. And then the kicker is honor the flagrant, open, homosexual activist himself, Nero, the king, which is amazing, because that's what, the killer of the Christians, honor him. And then he goes through servants and everything else. So what Caroline asked is, how do you submit to authority? What about the civil rights, all the stuff that went on? And I can add to that, strikes. Because my father, who worked for General Motors, it seemed like they were in the late 50s and early 60s, it seems like they were on strike every other month, And then I remember when I was a member of the Teamsters, when I worked for United Parcel Service, that's the one thing that I finally decided I couldn't keep working for them and be a Teamster and, be a Teamster, and fight for, with the brotherhood, with the other Teamsters. So what it says is that we're supposed to submit to the ordinance of man. That means that we pay our taxes even if we think that the government does bad things with it, because the government has always done bad things with it. The taxes that the Apostle Paul paid and that Peter paid by way of the Roman occupation funded the lavish orgies of the king, Nero. They did. And so this new thing we have nowadays, that we protest everything and we don't, there are actually Christians that don't pay their taxes and they consider it godly. It might in their minds be godly, but it's not biblical here. And so we have to be very cautious to work with the text. The scriptures make Christians to be the most law-abiding, solid citizens of all. And that's where Christians upholded all of the government's rights until they crossed over into direct disobedience. And so for civil rights, it is always wrong to discriminate against anyone. It's always wrong. Yet, Christians were on both sides of the civil rights. The South, many of them were as segregated as you could be. What's so interesting is that we have the same Bible. And if you ever want to read about it, there's a great book on this called Slavery, Segregation in the Scriptures by J. Oliver Buswell. And he talks about, because I hear many people saying, how come the Bible, right there in that verse I stopped on, verse 18, talks about slaves? And how can the Bible at all speak to the 21st century when it regulates slavery? The Bible regulated how people were to behave within the cultural context. So if there ever is a period in time when there's history, the people who honored God, if there was slavery, they were supposed to be the ones who treated their slaves with the utmost respect, with the utmost care, with no mistreatment of them, and to rightly pay them and everything else, because slavery was endemic. It was part of the fabric of the ancient world. And so all God did is he didn't condone and he didn't condemn. He just said, if you're a master, you're actually going to answer to me. And if you're a slave, you're actually going to answer to me and go. So number one, submission to government is clear. Now, if you back up to Romans 13, Paul enlarges on that beyond what Peter says. And we'll get into the sit-ins and all that Carolina talked about. But Romans 13 talks about starting in verse 1, let every soul be subject. And so basically, the word hupotasso means that you line up behind. It isn't that you obey everything they say. You line up behind everything that they're in charge of. That means that they're in charge of the taxation, that they're in charge of the laws and rules. And so in all of the areas where they don't impinge, where they don't cross over, as the apostle said, we have to serve God rather than man. But there are so few things we protest that actually are about serving God. It gets into us being concerned personally for our financial or our preferences. But it says there are no authorities except from God, verse 1. And the authorities exist are appointed by God. And I think that's part of the submission we were talking about this morning, even the trusting God aspect, that we know for sure that God himself placed Bill Clinton, Obama, and all the Republican presidents around them in office. A lot of people are celebrating. They think that our newest president is like an answer from the Lord. The previous one was too. Because look what it says in verse 1. All authorities that exist are appointed by God. He actually raises up and puts down kings. So what happens when we don't like the authorities, like whether it's segregation, the civil rights movement and all that? Verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you have praise. Now we get into what happens when the government puts into place laws that are unbiblical. Then comes the fact that Christians, we should be the ones that are most citing what God's moral code is. And we should be the ones, actually it should be that we who believe and know the Bible should be the ones that are saying that God has no respect of persons, that mankind is made of one blood, that there are no racial divisions. There aren't three races, there's only one. And it says in Acts 17, God has made from one blood all the nations of the earth and has appointed their habitations. So with God, he is colorblind and there's no racial distinction. Mankind and our humanness and our sinfulness and our selfishness and all that has raised those divisions. And so what do we do with society? Well, the best thing to do is to just keep repeating the scriptures and explaining it and stand for it and take part in the process. Remember, we think of the empire being monolithic. Actually, Rome had a system of laws and representation. If you read, and that's another book, if you really like to study this, there's a book called Daily Life in Ancient Rome. It was a Yale dissertation by a guy named Carcupino, and Daily Life, Ancient Rome. And it's a classic, just like Slavery, Segregation, the Scriptures. And Carcupino shows that there was absolutely at every level, from what we would call the local, the precinct, all the way up, there was representation in the Roman government. There was an emperor, but there still was an amazing amount of local governance that Christians could, if they were citizens, could be involved in. And remember, Paul took advantage of, he knew his rights and he expressed them. So in every level that we can express the truth, we should. But what about marches? Well, it depends. It depends on whether or not we want to be identified with those who are not submitting, usually people that are involved in resistance movements, which we see a lot of resistance now, that's what it's being called, the political thing, aren't just against the ones that are against the scriptures. They're against all of their social issues, their agenda. So Christians have to be very careful about getting involved in something that is a wholesale kind of resistance to one whole direction, the military-industrial complex or whatever they're protesting. And that whole civil rights thing got caught up in a lot of other parts. Now, for me, I believe that we should be representing non-discriminatory, total racial equality and biblical standards. Do I believe personally that you march for it? I don't. Sit in? No. Speak? Yes. But always, that's just my personal, I don't even like parties or crowds. So, don't ask me that. I would rather study. But for some people, they love to represent Christ in the marketplace, and as long as you're representing Christ. Now remember, he was not loud, boisterous, and fighting, except for God. Twice, cleaning out the temple. Did Jesus say anything about the injustices? Yeah. Remember when he's preaching along, he tells them, if you're discontent with your wages, don't be. Whoa. So Jesus was not for strikes. Do you remember when, actually John the Baptist is the one that told them, the soldiers, if you don't like your wages, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go to strike? No. But what we're supposed to see is we do stand for right, but as far as a biblical mandate for resistance, aggressive resistance, even to the form of overthrow. I'm glad Carolina didn't ask me my opinion of the American Revolution, because it's not very good. Revolutions aren't really ordained in the Scripture. Rather, the standing for what is right and being willing to suffer for what is right, but not to overthrow. Overthrow isn't a real biblical concept. So Caroline, if you just want my opinion, we're always supposed to submit to authority. That's what Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 say. And when the authority is wrong, we stand up, as Daniel did. The three, in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as each one that we see standing up for what is wrong and representing God, and the apostles, and the early believers, saying we ought to obey God rather than man. Make sure it's a biblical issue. Make sure it's actually something that I am commanded to do. I'm not commanded to be discriminatory. Our country might be, but our country is pagan. Our country will never be Christian. We cannot Christianize America or any other nation. So, see, that's where Christians, they're fighting to Christianize something that can never be Christian. A nation can never be Christian. God couldn't even run a theocracy directly there without killing people to make them obey. God does not force us to obey. We cannot force pagans to take Christian values. We can live it, we can stand for it, we can proclaim it, but to be known as an activist for civil rights when we're not known as an activist for Christ, for salvation. See, that's what's so interesting. People will get totally caught up in civil rights or environmental rights or whatever that have never taken a stand. You never see them on the corner preaching, but they'll protest or sit in or whatever, resist. Which is worse, to be discriminated against or go to hell? Which is worse? And yet they get worked up over the discrimination rather than over the lostness of the world. So, and I'm going to go beyond the question. So, Carolina, where did you go? Oh, right there. Did I say enough? Because I'm going to get in trouble, because I am getting tired and tired. So she releases me from saying any more. Okay. Thank you, Carolina. And no follow-up question on that.